All right, I got to tell you, adults, there were more of the kids that left than there are left in the auditorium. They got you outnumbered tonight, I think. It's nice to see so many children. In these lessons that we've been studying, and we're just about finished with this particular section, we've been studying about our attitude towards money and our wealth and possessions. We've looked at Jesus' teachings. We finished that one this morning. Tonight, I just wanted to do one lesson on tithing throughout the Bible. I decided to move it to Sunday nights, a little more of a in-depth kind of a study, which is fine for Sunday morning too, but I decided to move it till tonight, and then next week we'll conclude with New Testament guide passages. Tonight, then, we're going to take a look at tithing in the Bible. So we've studied worshipful giving. More than acts of charity to benefit men, giving is a worshipful act. It's directed to God Himself. We even consider it to be one of the acts of worship that we participate in as a group of believers. So tonight we're going to look at tithing. There's just something fancy to look at. This is going to be the outline we're going to use tonight then in our lesson. And don't worry, they're not all like 10 minutes long or anything. But first we're going to look at tithing in the patriarchal age. The patriarchal age is the time prior to the law being given when God spoke to the heads of families. And then we're going to look at tithing in the Mosaic age. That's the period of time from the law being given by Moses until the age of Christianity when Jesus died on the cross. We're also going to just take a peek and look at first fruits as offered especially in the Old Testament. Free will offerings, we'll look at that momentarily or briefly. And then an Old Testament example of generous giving that was a free will offering that was very impressive. And then finally, we're going to look at tithing in the New Testament. So first will be tithing in the patriarchal age. If you turn your Bibles to Genesis chapter 14, please. Genesis chapter 14. Genesis chapter 14, beginning in verse 17. After Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shavez, that is, the king's valley. Then Melchizedek, the king of Salem, that is Jerusalem if you look in your footnote, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High, and he blessed Abram, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. So here in this passage, we find the first example, really the only example, of a patriarchal father, that is Abram or Abraham, giving a tenth of his spoils of his war to God. He gives a tenth of everything, it says, to Melchizedek, who is a priest of God Most High. Tithe actually means tenth. So by definition, you cannot give an 8% tithe. By definition, you can't give a 5% tithe. Tithe means 10%. So if you tithe, you give 10%. Sometimes tithing kind of gets substituted for the word just giving in general. Say, well, I tithe 8%. But really, tithing means a tenth. That's what the word means. There was no or is no patriarchal biblical command to give a tenth. So there's nowhere during this period of time where a command is given, you must give a tenth. But this example, I believe, kind of sets a pattern that we find in the Bible, a precedent, if you will, of acceptable gifts given by righteous people to God. It's the example we have then of Abram. He comes back from war. He sees this priest of the Most High God, Melchizedek, and he gives him a tenth of everything of the spoils of war. Here's a little more of the details of this particular battle. Abram rescued Lot, who had been taken captive by raiding kings. And Abram gathered together a band of men to go after Lot and secure his release and the defeat of the offending kings. And upon his triumphal return, Melchizedek, the king of Salem, came out to meet him and give him a blessing and Abram gave Melchizedek a tithe. So we're going to use this as sort of a crude timeline, if you will. And we have the three different ages of history: the patriarchal age, that is the time from creation until Moses, or the Mosaic age. And then the Mosaic age, which is most of the Bible that we have of the Old Testament. And then we have the Christian age, which would start at the time of Christ and go all the way until today. Here we find then, we've stuck on the timeline, Abram gives a tithe to God's priest Melchizedek. So in my mind, then, it is a patriarchal example of a tithe being given. Number two, tithing in the Mosaic age. Now we have a lot more information in the Mosaic age, because in the Mosaic age, God commanded that a tithe be given. So we'll look at two examples here on our timeline. The first we're going to look at is Leviticus 27 in verse 30. It is during this time period, this time of Bible history or earth history, that we find that a command is given to tithe. And here it is from verse 30 of Leviticus 27. And you can find many more than this. This is just one example. A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the spoil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. So a tithe is set up then in the Mosaic age, and it goes all the way through the periods of the kings and the prophets. Also, during the same time period in the Mosaic age, we'll add another time marker. Hundreds of years later, during the time of King Hezekiah, who was king around 700 BC, along in that time period. And this is a 2 Chronicles 31:5 example. As soon as the order went out, the Israelites generously gave the first fruits of their grain, new wine, oil, and honey, and all that the fields produced. They brought a great amount, a tithe of everything. Tithing then commanded during this age, this time frame, this period of biblical history, not only at its beginnings at the time of Moses when it was commanded and part of the law, but still in practice by those who were faithful and righteous, through the time of Hezekiah, who was a righteous and good king. Tithing is an Old Testament concept. The tithe was a requirement of the law in which the Israelites were to give 10% of the crops they grew and the livestock they raised to the tabernacle and the temple. And there are some scriptures. In fact, the Old Testament law required multiple tithes, one for the Levites, one for the use of the temple and the feast, and one for the poor of the land, which would have pushed the total to around 23.3% if you add it all up. Of course, during a time when these funds were also being used to take care of the poor and take care of the elderly, it would have had a social benefit as well to their community of people. That's tithing then during the Mosaic age. The next thing I want us to consider then is first fruits. First fruits. God has always desired from us, from His people, and deserved the first fruits, not the leftovers. One of the principles we're going to see in next Sunday morning's lesson is the importance of being purposeful in your giving, of laying by in store as you've been prospered, to do it on purpose, to do it with a plan, to be sacrificial and cheerful, yes, but to do it purposefully. I think sometimes we relegate our giving to maybe just what we happen to have left over. And that really puts God in a leftover position rather than a first fruits position. Sometimes maybe we adopt the idea that we would do if someone came by and knocked on the door collecting for some good cause, and we rush to the dresser to kind of see what change or few dollars we have on the dresser and give them to the person as an afterthought. But God has always desired and deserved what's first from us. In Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 9 and 10, He brought us to this place, this good place, this promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey, And now I bring the first fruits of the soil that you, O Lord, have given me. Place the basket before the Lord your God and bow down before him. The seconds are the leftovers, the blind animals, the lame, the sick. All these are unacceptable and indeed insulting to God. And I guess there was a human tendency by those who had great economic gains in their flocks and herds to not want to part with the very best. The unblemished would have been very valuable. The perfect animal would have had a lot of value for them. So it might be tempting to say, well, this one's a little bit limp. This one's a little bit diseased. This one's a little bit crippled. Let's give that one. Maybe God won't notice. But these kind of unacceptable and indeed insulting gifts to God were definitely unrighteous. In Malachi chapter 1, verse 8, we have this verse. It almost has a sense of humor to it, where the prophet writes, when you bring blind animals for sacrifice, is that not wrong? And when you sacrifice crippled or diseased animals, is that not wrong? Try offering them to your governor. You wouldn't do that? And why would you offer those to God? Let's turn in your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 24 for a beautiful example from the life of David. 2 Samuel 24. Beginning in verse 18. On that day, Gad went to David and said to him, go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. So David went up as the Lord had commanded through Gad, and when Araunah looked and saw the king and his men coming toward him, he went out and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground. And Araunah said, why has my lord the king come to his servant? To buy your threshing floor, David answered, so I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague may be stopped. Araunah said to David, let my lord the king take whatever pleases him and offer it up. Here are the oxen for the burnt offering. Here are the threshing sledges and ox yokes for the wood. O king, Araunah gives all this to the king. Araunah also said to him, may the Lord your God accept you. But the king replied to Araunah, and this then is the pivotal moment and the great statement of David. No, I insist on paying for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. And David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. And the Lord answered prayer in behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. It's a beautiful attitude then displayed by David. I'll give it to you for free. No, I don't want it for free, because I'm not going to offer to God something that costs me nothing. I'm going to pay for it myself, because I want it to be mine and come from me as a sacrifice that I've presented. It's a wonderful attitude from David. Number 4, free will offerings. Now we're off from the tithe a little bit because during the Mosaic age, the tithes were required. They were given as a command by God to give a tithe and to give these first fruits. But in addition to the required tithes, people whose hearts were moved or whose hearts were motivated also gave free will offerings. These offerings then would be above the required tithe. If a person was moved by some blessing God had given them, or for some cause that they might be collecting funds for, or someone that they knew or saw that needed help, they could give free will offerings in addition to the other offerings and tithes. The Message says in Numbers 29:39, sacrifice these to God as a congregation at your set feasts, your whole burnt offerings, grain offerings, drink offerings, peace offerings. These are all over and above your personal vow offerings and free will offerings. So there were many opportunities to give offerings, and one of these was the free will offering, just because. Free will offerings were non-required gifts of love, gifts of thanksgiving and adoration. And they were above and beyond the expected and motivated by generous hearts. So this was just because I love God, because I want to. Next, let's look at an Old Testament example of generous giving. It's one of those inspiring Old Testament times when the children of Israel actually did something really great. And a lot of times we focus and look at their grumbling, and we see how they complained and how they were easy to turn their hearts back away from God. But in this case, they really had a beautiful heart and did things right. It's found in Exodus chapter 36. Exodus chapter 36. Let's begin in verse 2. Then Moses summoned Bezalel and Oholiab and every skilled person to whom the Lord had given ability, and who was willing to come and do the work. This is in the construction of the tabernacle. They received from Moses all the offerings the Israelites had brought to carry out the work of constructing the sanctuary. And the people continued to bring free will offerings morning after morning. And so all the skilled craftsmen who were doing all the work on the sanctuary left their work and said to Moses, "The people are bringing more than enough for doing the work of the Lord." And Moses gave an order, and they sent this word throughout the camp: "No man or woman is to make anything else as an offering for the sanctuary." And so the people were, and notice these words, the people were restrained from bringing more because what they already had was more than enough to do the work. This is a beautiful example then where free will offerings were being made to construct the tabernacle, provide the furnishings for it. And so much was given that Moses said, tell the people to stop bringing things because they've given more than enough. It's a beautiful example then of generous giving. They gave so much, they had to be told to stop. So in great contrast to compulsory giving or coerced giving, these Israelites impress us with their great example of free will giving. Now this is going to be important. I don't want to spill the future too much, but that's the kind of giving that we do, is the free will giving that comes from our heart. Let's turn to number 367 in our books. I want to sing this song. It's a beautiful song. It's about this great generosity of spirit, of giving. Take my life and let it be. And in this he speaks about giving our life, our hands, our voice, our silver and gold, our will, and our love to Christ. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to Thee. Take my moments and my days, let them flow in ceaseless praise. Take my hands and let them move at the impulse of Thy love. Take my feet and let them be swift and beautiful for Thee. Take my voice and let me sing, always only for my King. Take my lips and let them be messages from thee. Take my silver and my gold, not a mite would I withhold. Take my intellect and use every power as thou shalt choose. Take my will and make it thine. It shall be no longer mine. Take my heart, it is thy own. It shall be thy royal throne. Take my love, my Lord, I pour at thy feet its treasure store. Take myself and I will be ever only all for thee. Finally, in tonight's lesson, let's look at tithing in the New Testament. I have to admit, I kind of put this in there as a teaser about tithing in the New Testament, because in actuality, there is no command or authoritative example of tithing in the New Testament. So if you're looking at that and saying, wait a minute, I don't know about this one, you're right. It's not in the New Testament at all. There's no command or not even an authoritative example that we find of tithing in the New Testament. But we do have something much greater than tithing for us. Here's one of them, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 6 and 7. If we put it on let's go back. If we put it here on our timeline, we find that in the Christian age, we are to give generously. That's our standard. We are to give cheerfully. There's our standard. We are to give from our hearts. That is our standard. We find this in 2 Corinthians 9, verses 6 and 7. Remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each man should give what he has decided in his heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Let's think about it. A person can be required to give 10%. Give it, obey the law, but not enjoy it. It not be from the heart, and it not be of a generous and cheerful spirit. Once again, there is no command or authoritative example of tithing in the New Testament. Our standard is generosity, cheerfulness, and from our hearts. There are other standards as well. We'll explore more next week. But this is a good beginning scripture. Now, having stated this, some do offer tithing as a good biblical precedent. I just want you to think about this. Since tithing was acceptable to God in 2 ages, we found it with Abraham in the patriarchal age. We find it as a command that God gives in the Mosaic age. It may serve as a good example for us, a good minimum standard, a benchmark for us to use in our New Testament giving. Dave Ramsey, who we've done some Dave Ramsey classes, of course he's a non-biblical source, but a man who gives good advice on Christian giving, has said this about tithing. Tithing was created for our benefit. It teaches us how to keep God first in our lives, how to live unselfishly. Unselfish people make better spouses, friends, relatives, employees, and employers, and they usually have better finances. God is trying to teach us. For any of you who've taken the Dave Ramsey class, you'll know that it is the very first thing in his written budget. It's 10%. It's the very first thing. It's the top thing. Everyone who does a Dave Ramsey style budget puts 10% of his gross finances, puts them number one in his budget, putting God in his rightful place first. Now, these are a couple slides, just things that I have thought of myself. I think sometimes abuses of church finances or perceived abuses and televangelists who shame people into giving can poison the spirit of generosity in Christian giving. That we must guard our hearts against suspicious or a jaded spirit and realize that ultimately our gifts are worshipful acts to God. And sometimes people do abuse us with our finances. I think we need to be prudent, we need to be wise, but I think there are times that we can give and be abused by. But remember, we're giving to God. That's to whom we give our gifts and for His cause. We must guard our hearts and not become suspicious and jaded or even use our finances to try to manipulate agendas, even in the church. One other thought, and that is on, I think, proactive giving. That is purposeful giving, offering at the church assembly, seeking out charitable organizations. David Cronoto and I spoke about this morning, so I included it in the lesson tonight. Maybe preparing gift packages to give to homeless people. He had spoken with me. Perhaps we could put together some Ziploc bags that have socks and water and food. And so when you're caught in a situation where you don't know, should I give money? What if they don't really need it? What should I do? That we're prepared in advance. Or, of course, offering in the church assembly is a place where the money is thought out in the way that it is given out and disseminated and given in a good and righteous way. Rather than just reactive giving, randomly being asked, may help curb abuses to Christian giving and guard our hearts against callousness, because sometimes it's when we feel abused that we become callous. And we as God's people need to be open-handed and charitable and have good hearts. And we don't want someone else's unkindness to make us unkind. And we don't want someone else's abuse of our kindness to make us hard-hearted. I liked this quote from gotquestions.org. While a tithe or tenth of one's finances may be a good standard to use for Christian giving, it is clear the early church did not focus on a specific amount, but rather on meeting needs. And this sometimes included giving much more than a tenth, as some believers sold homes or land to meet the needs that existed in the church. In summary then for tonight's lesson, there is a precedent for tithing throughout biblical history. Abraham tithed, Moses commanded tithing, and all the righteous peoples throughout the biblical Old Testament tithed. And whereas tithing may serve as a good benchmark for Christian givers, the New Testament offers no tithing requirement. Christians are to give as they had purposed in their hearts, to give cheerfully and generously. 10% might be a good minimum for us, because we, of all ages of history, are the most blessed. We have the life of Christ. We have the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus that we know about and benefit from. Next week, then, we will look at the New Testament, the guide passages that are there to instruct us more in our worshipful giving. It's just going to be one day, just next week, and we'll be finished. And we will more fully explore giving for the church and the Christian age. Bottom line, God has blessed us. God's been good to us. And rather than hold on, let's give. Let's be generous. Let's be people that love others, that have the compassion I spoke about this morning, and who purposefully, with great intent and with great love in our hearts, give freely to bless those around us that God may be glorified. If you'd like to respond tonight, God's been so good to us. If you'd like prayers from the church, please come as we stand and sing.